Before we get started, I just want to say chapter 11 is a doozy, and I'm sure y'all have already realized that with studying it. And so it's going to be very interesting, and I'm going to take a very interesting approach. I'm going to take some aspects are going to be a very basic approach, and then we're going to go by our study book and also look at some other references and resources. So I just wanted to say that before we got started. Okay, tonight we continue Daniel chapter 11, and this is about the king of the south and the king of the north. And I've titled this one part 1. It'll probably take us a couple of sessions to get through chapter 11 because there's a lot to it. So last week we saw Berenice, her son, and her Egyptian court murdered. Remember, Laodice murdered her, and her court assisted her in taking out Berenice, her son, and her Egyptian court that took her up to the northern kingdom. So, quick retribution occurs when her brother Ptolemy III, the king of the south, takes revenge on the northern kingdom. Ptolemy III could have taken the whole Seleucus kingdom. He was that close if he had not been called back to Egypt for domestic sedition. The plan to unite the two kingdoms via marriage had failed miserably. Later, we saw Ptolemy V Epiphanes, the 5-year-old king, take the throne in the south. A 5-year-old king was seemingly an easy victory as viewed by Antiochus III, or some of you may pronounce that Antiochus. I pronounce it Antiochus the Great. However, pagan imperial Rome also sees an opportunity to control Egypt, the south, without war. They declare, "We, Rome, will protect the boy king." Ultimately, in 190 BC, Rome defeats Antiochus III the Great. Thus, we start seeing the fourth beast of Daniel begin to rise. Now, for an introduction, we're going to listen to about 10 minutes of Mark McMillan's video on Daniel 11, Part A.
Hi again, I'm Mark. We're going to have a Bible class on Daniel chapter 11 up to verse 31. Why is this chapter important? When Jesus of Nazareth was asked about his future return to this earth, he didn't point his disciples toward the prophet Ezekiel. He didn't point them toward Zechariah or Jeremiah. He pointed them toward the prophet Daniel and to a place in Daniel chapter 11. And Jesus went even further to say about this place in Daniel 11, whoever reads, let him understand. It must be important. But Daniel chapter 11 is like beefsteak. And with beefsteak, you have to cut it up into pieces small enough to eat, and then you have to chew it a while. That's what we're going to need to do with this chapter. So we're going to start out by briefly looking over the chapter before this, Daniel chapter 10. In Daniel 10, we saw how that Daniel, a man by then well up into his 80s, had been praying and fasting for 3 weeks. But then, as he was with his friends beside the Tigris River, a mighty angel appeared to him, and the experience took him to the limits of what he was able to handle as a human being. The angel explained that he'd been trying to get through to Daniel as his prayers had been heard. But the angel went on to say that a demon prince from the dark side of the spiritual world, the angel called him the Prince of Persia, had been withstanding the angel for the whole time. And it was revealed to Daniel that the archangel Michael, one of the chief princes, had come to help the angel, and that he was now able to communicate with Daniel. Daniel chapter 10 contains some of the most profound, revealing information in the Bible on the subject of the spiritual world and the warfare that goes on there. Chapter 10 laid the groundwork for the information that was then given to Daniel in chapter 11. We've already had a bird's eye view of chapter 10, but we'll look once more at the last couple of verses there and see how they flow into the beginning of Daniel chapter 11. Daniel 10, verses 20 and 21. Then he said, "Do you know why I've come to you? And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I have gone forth, indeed the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth, and no one opposes me against these except Michael, your prince." And we'll go straight into Daniel 11. "Also in the first year of Darius the Mede, I, even I, stood to confirm and strengthen him. And now I will tell you the truth." The text and dialogue flows right into chapter 11. The angel continues talking to Daniel. They just made a chapter break. In all the other chapters up to this, there was a clear end of the chapter at the last verse of the chapter. But here the text flows right into chapter 11. Daniel 11, verses 2b and 3. "Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." What I'll emphasize here is what is spoken about a mighty king shall arise. We know from history that this is speaking prophetically of Alexander the Great of Greece. We studied about him extensively in the video on Daniel chapter 8. Daniel 11, verse 4. "And when he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these." And here again we find an amazingly powerful prophetic prevision of the fate of Alexander the Great and his empire. It says, "His kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven." Alexander's empire was indeed broken up into 4 parts. When Alexander was nearly 33 years old, he died of a high fever in a palace in Babylon. He had no son to succeed him, and so his empire was divided between his 4 top generals, just as Daniel was shown here. And this same division of the empire into 4 parts was also revealed in Daniel chapter 7 and again in Daniel chapter 8. Cassander ruled Macedonia and Greece, Lysimachus the area we know today as Turkey, Seleucus the region from Syria to India, and Ptolemy the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and parts of North Africa. These 4 were called the Diadochi. It might surprise you to know that I've virtually never taught on what is the next section in Daniel 11, verses 5 to 20. The reason why I haven't taught about those verses in classes before this is because they're very detailed, and they're foretelling things that would happen from around the time of Alexander to the time of Jesus. Most of us in our times have never heard about those people or events, so I usually start up at verse 21. But since I'm doing a video on the chapter, I felt it would be good to include all the verses. You may find that you'll want to skip forward in the class by about 4.5 minutes to where we start up with what are, for us, future events from verse 21. Or you may want to check out the history that the angel foretold to Daniel in verses 5 to 20. Daniel 11, verse 5. "Also the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion." Most of the verses in this section are going to be talking about the king of the south and the king of the north. This is in reference to what became the 2 main divisions of Alexander's empire. The southern part, which was the Ptolemaic realm, and then the northern part, which was the kingdom of Seleucus. These 2 kingdoms continually disputed over areas of what are modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, and so we get the phrase, the king of the north, and the king of the south. Verses 6 through 8. And at the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal against them, and shall prevail. He shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Some wonderful research has been done long ago to show how precisely and minutely these verses were fulfilled in the times after Alexander the Great. But I won't get into that here, since my focus will be on the prophetic verses still yet to be fulfilled. Verses 9 through 12. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. But his son shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. And one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up, even to his fortress. And the king of the south shall be moved with rage, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he has taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. In 217 BC, a war was fought in southern Palestine. Ptolemy IV, the king of the south, who had 70,000 infantrymen, 5,000 horsemen, and 73 elephants, fought against Antiochus III, the king of the north, who had slightly fewer but similar forces. Verses 13 through 16. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army, and with much riches. In those times shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of your people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come, and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that comes against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. History tells of Ptolemy the first, the second, the third, and the fourth, and of Antiochus, the first, the second, the third, and the fourth. We see Cleopatra, but not the Cleopatra of the Roman general Mark Antony, being spoken of in the next verses. Verses 17 to 20. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. After this shall he turn his face to the isles, and shall take many. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the ford of his own land, but he shall stumble, fall, and not be found. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes and the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle.
Okay, so the king of the north and the king of the south, there were several of them. And there were several battles between the two. And of course, Israel, Jerusalem, was right smack dab in the middle of these two warring nations and kings. And so last week, we had left off with, we had just finished verses 12 and 13, when it read, and when he, Ptolemy the fourth, Epiphanes, hath taken away the multitude, meaning the army of Antiochus the third, his heart, Ptolemy's heart, shall be lifted up, and he, Ptolemy the fourth, shall cast down many 10,000s of the Jews in Jerusalem at that time. But he, Ptolemy the fourth, shall not be strengthened by it. In verse 13, it's titled, A 5-year-old Ptolemy the Fifth Epiphanes became king of the south, becomes pharaoh in Egypt, 203 BC. The king of the north invades the king of the south's territory in Palestine in 201 BC. So it reads in verse 13, "For the king of the north, Antiochus III, shall return after about 14 years of peace, and shall set forth a multitude, an army greater than the former army, an immense army, and shall certainly come after certain years to invade the Egyptian territory of Palestine with a great army and with much riches." Now on page 278 of your books, it says between verses 12 and 13, peace lasted about 14 years after the Battle of Raphia between Syria and Egypt. During this time, Antiochus III suppresses rebellion in his kingdom and recovers the eastern and western territories from India to the Aegean Sea, becoming king of the north, again over most of Alexander's former kingdom. And then about 203 BC, Ptolemy IV Epiphanes, king of the south, and his wife died. That is why their 5-year-old son, Ptolemy V Epiphanes, ascends to the throne. Then the footnotes on verse 13 reads, "The accession of the boy child Ptolemy V Epiphanes presented Antiochus III with the opportunity of avenging himself upon the Egyptians. He now prepared for a second attack on Egypt. Antiochus III, also known as the Great, thought he could overcome the young, vulnerable Ptolemy V Epiphanes, so he raised an immense army against Egypt. Others wished to join them to split up Egypt, thinking a 5-year-old didn't have a chance. An easy victory over the king was expected. 201 BC, on the way to Egypt, he invaded Egyptian territory in Palestine. But make note here that pagan imperial Rome emerges approximately 200 BC. So pagan imperial Rome was the mistress of the then known Mediterranean world and had begun to enter into contracts with the East. The Romans interfered on behalf of the young king of Egypt and determined that Ptolemy V Epiphanes should be protected from the ruin devised by Antiochus III of Syria and Philip of Macedonia. Rome saw an opportunity to control Egypt without war. The declaration was made, "We, Rome, will protect the boy king." Thus, Rome began to take Egypt under its dominion. We continue in verse 14, and it says, "And in those times there shall be many," meaning rebellious Egyptians, Antiochus III, Philip of Macedon, stand up against the king of the south, the 5-year-old Ptolemy V Epiphanes. So Antiochus III, the Great from Syria, then the prime minister of Egypt and provinces rebelled against the boy child Ptolemy as well. Alexandrians of Egypt rose against their prime minister. Philip of Macedonia teamed with Antiochus III to divide the dominions between them. I mean, it was like ravenous wolves coming after this 5-year-old. So this was the rising up against the king of the south to fulfill the prophecy. So pagan imperial Rome emerges approximately 200 BC. Rome was a mistress of the Western Mediterranean and had begun to enter into contracts with the East. In 197 BC, Rome defeats Macedonia and set up the Greek states under her protection. Antiochus III takes Palestine. 190 BC, Rome defeated Antiochus III the Great. 168 BC, Battle of Pydna. Rome ended the monarchy of Macedonia and divided it into 4 confederacies. 168 BC, Rome's power and mastery over the East is reasoned by the removal of the monarchs from the 3 Hellenistic kingdoms. Rome exercised complete control. But all of this took time over several years. So Rome was known as the mistress of the Western Mediterranean. Now, from a website blog that I came across, I thought it was interesting. He does a good work. It's the URL is in the bottom right-hand corner, studygrowknowblog.com. And I'll leave these links when I send out the recorded session for you to go and look at some of these, the research done by others. But this is what he states about Ptolemy V, the boy. Things are not looking good for the king of the south, Egypt. It seems everyone wants a piece of him and his kingdom. We now see, according to historical fact, that the Macedonians and the Jews themselves joined with Antiochus III against Ptolemy V and Egypt itself. Why did the Jews throw their lot in with Antiochus III? According to Constable, quote, evidently, some of the politically zealous Jews believed that they could gain more freedom if Antiochus III succeeded, but that did not happen. This is the problem with getting involved in something over politics. You never know how it's going to turn out. These Jews were putting their trust in some political figure, the king of the north, to help them. The problem, of course, is that they should have been turning instead to their own Elohim or God, but didn't. They trusted in themselves and were bitten on the backside for their troubles. Had they sought Yahweh or God, Elohim, and repented of their rebellion, submitted themselves to him and his ways, things would have undoubtedly turned out differently. I think this same thing applies to Christians. Instead of focusing on and trusting Yahweh for outcomes, many times we do put our faith in politicians, which of course this is very timely as the United States faces this election result tonight. The kings of the north and the south. This is from blowthetrumpet.com. It begins with stating war is coming. You know, we're all rather expecting, from what we've read about, what we've heard about, World War III. We know that the powers that be have planned these wars, World War I, World War II, and we've heard about a possible World War III. Now, if this occurs, I have always envisioned it occurring just prior to the last 7 years. But we can only speculate. So here we read, according to the prophet Daniel, there will be a final battle between the king of the north and the king of the south, which will also see other nations drawn into the conflict as they were in the 2 previous world wars. Historically, there have already been at least 6 wars fought between the kings of the north with the kings of the south. And these previous wars in history all teach us about a final conflict that will occur in the Middle East between the last king of the north with the last king of the south. Seleucus and Ptolemy. Now we know Seleucus was king of the north, Syria, and Ptolemy was king of the south, Egypt. And there were several kings of the north fighting against several kings of the south in history, and this will remain and reoccur in the end of days. Historically, the first kings of the north and the south were Seleucus and Ptolemy. These were two of the four generals that split Alexander the Great's empire into four parts after he died. The two empires that Daniel focused on were the Seleucid and the Ptolemy empires, which fought each other in several battles. For territory, Seleucus eventually got control of what we now know as Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of Turkey. He reigned for a time from Babylon in modern Iraq and built a new capital city 20 miles to the southeast on the Tigris River and named it Seleucia. Now, Ptolemy took Libya, Egypt, the Sudan, Israel, and Jordan, and chose Alexandria in Egypt as his capital. According to history in the book of Daniel, there was a prolonged war between these two kingdoms. 6 wars. Daniel records these wars in the earlier part of Daniel chapter 11. I mean, that was just like Mark McMillian said, like the historical part of chapter 11 is covered between verses 5 and verses 20. There were 6 wars between the Ptolemy and the Seleucid kingdoms from 274 BC to 168 BC. The last major king of the north to emerge was Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid Greek general, who swept down into Egypt and then into the land of Israel, invaded the city of Jerusalem, and desecrated the Temple Mount. If you look, and this is an important sentence right here, if you look at the same geographical areas today that made up the kingdoms of Seleucus and Ptolemy, you can well see another north and south conflict brewing. So that was a point that came to my mind before I even read that sentence. Again, if you look over those countries, I have the king of the north countries underlined in orange, the king of the south countries underlined in purple. And the question is, do these territories today help us identify who the king of the north and south might be today by the territories associated with each? Because it doesn't have to be limited to just those that we see on the screen, because we know how these other major nations become involved with these Middle Eastern nations. Again, there were 6 wars, and those are the ones listed in front of you. Now, we know that the king of the south, let me get my pointer for just a minute. The king of the south, they were strong, but the king of the north was stronger. That was recorded in Daniel chapter 11, verse 5. Later on, we see Antiochus II here and Ptolemy II attempt to join the kingdoms via marriage. That was when we read about Berenice. That was in Daniel chapter 11, verse 6. Then we saw that Berenice was murdered by Laodice. And her name, Laodice, the city of Laodicea was named after Laodice. And so Laodice and her supporters kill Berenice's son, kills the Egyptian court that had brought her up to the king of the north. And word gets back to Ptolemy III here, who was her brother. And Ptolemy III, I put the second, but that should be the third, avenges the death of his sister Berenice by attacking and killing Laodice and Seleucus II. In the Fourth Syrian War, Antiochus III the Great captures Israel, because we have to remember, see this note to the right, these two kingdoms butted right up against the other. Israel was technically part of the southern kingdom controlled by Egypt. So we will see, and history tells us that this territory flip-flopped between the king of the south and the king of the north several times. Then we have the Fifth War, and this was when Ptolemy became the Pharaoh of Egypt, the 5-year-old. And we know that Antiochus III, along with Cleopatra I, and as Mark McMillian had mentioned, and also as I had found out as I was studying, that that's not the same Cleopatra as the one with Mark Antony. That occurs later in about 47 BC, when Julius Caesar oversees pagan imperial Rome, because this is taking place in about 202 to 195 BC. So in 47 BC, Julius Caesar oversaw pagan imperial Rome, king of the north. 51 BC, Cleopatra and Ptolemy the 12th, who were ages 9 and 10, were left the crown over the southern kingdom, and their story is told in our study book on page 284. So I just wanted to bring it to our attention that this Cleopatra is not the same as that Cleopatra. And this war was when pagan imperial Rome said, we, Rome, will protect the boy king. So I want us to listen to this little news clip to kind of bring us into the here and now of what's going on in the Middle East.
TV7 Israel News is made possible thanks to your generous donations. Shalom, good evening. This is TV7 Israel News, broadcast to you from Jerusalem. And in today's top stories, Israeli Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi reiterates to his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov Jerusalem's resolve to thwart Iran's military entrenchment in Syria. Moscow offers to broker a negotiated solution between Ankara and Athens on all that pertains to the East Mediterranean dispute. Tensions are rapidly increasing between Turkey and Europe, and separately between Ankara and Washington. Sudan's decision to normalize its relations with Israel is derived from mutual interests, amid growing domestic opposition from some of the country's prominent political factions. Chairman of the Sovereign Council of Sudan, Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, provided a first public interview on the matter, in which he sought to defend his decision, insisting that when reconciliation benefits both parties, a deal to that effect is legitimate.
نحن لما نتحدث عن رفع العقوبات عن السودان لا نستطيع أن نتحدث بمعزل عن التطبيع مع إسرائيل. أنا أفضل دائما أن أسميه صلح بدل تطبيع، لأنه نحن الآن بنعمل اتفاقية صلح، والصلح عمل مشروع حتى مع الأعداء، مع كل جهة يمكن أن تبرم الصلح الذي يصب في مصلحة المتصالحين الاثنين.
General al-Burhan went on to reject claims of blackmail which were voiced by pro-Iranian and Islamist figures in the country, stressing instead that peace between Jerusalem and Khartoum under U.S. mediation essentially benefits Sudan more than it benefits the state of Israel. Turning to Greece, where Israeli Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi headed an Israeli delegation to Athens for the purpose of attending a trilateral summit with his Greek and Cypriot counterparts. Upon arrival in the Greek capital, Foreign Minister Ashkenazi initially held a meeting with Moscow's visiting Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, during which he reiterated to his Russian counterpart Israel's resolve not to permit Iran's military entrenchment in Syria. The Israeli top diplomat, during a meeting behind closed doors, further reiterated Jerusalem's position, which ascertains that there is a need to proactively implement an arms embargo on the Islamic Republic of Iran, which continues to destabilize the Middle East. Earlier in the day, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, during which the latter voiced Athens' frustration over the policies pursued by Ankara.
Συναντιόμαστε, η αλήθεια είναι, σε μια δύσκολη συγκυρία, καθοριστική, καθώς η χώρα μου, η Ανατολική Μεσόγειος, ο Νότιος Κάφκασος, η ευρύτερη περιοχή μας, είναι μια περιοχή στην οποία δοκιμάζεται η διεθνή σταθερότητα. Και θα έχω την ευκαιρία στις συνομιλίες μας να σας ενημερώσω για την δράση της γειτονικής Τουρκίας, η οποία δυστυχώς σε ρόλο ταραξία καταπατά την διεθνή νομιμότητα, ναρκοθετώντας την ειρήνη σε πολλά ευαίσθητα σημεία του χάρτη. Και βέβαια κάτι το οποίο με προβληματίζει ιδιαίτερα είναι ότι περιβάλλει αυτήν την επιθετική της δράση με έναν θρησκευτικό μανδύα, καθιστώντας έτσι ορατό τον κίνδυνο για την αρμονική συνύπαρξη λαών και θρησκειών.
Following a series of meetings between Lavrov, Premier Mitsotakis, and Greek Foreign Minister Nikos Dendias, respectively, the Russian Foreign Minister voiced Moscow's position regarding the latest developments in the eastern Mediterranean.
Что касается Восточного Средиземноморья, я, в общем, могу подтвердить то, что я сказал. Здесь проблем накапливается немало к тем, которые годами сохранялись в этом регионе, особенно в южной части Средиземного моря. Добавились новые проблемы, о них хорошо известно. Все они, по нашему глубокому убеждению, должны решаться на основе международного права. И насчет того, есть ли у нас какая-то инициатива, вы знаете, мне кажется, это вот общий такой посыл. Конвенция по морскому праву, другие международно-правовые документы, которые необходимо в полной мере выполнять. Это ключ к тому, чтобы мы все-таки ситуацию немножко успокоили, перевели ее в переговорное русло. Наверное, прежде всего прибрежные страны должны проявлять инициативу, если нас вдруг кто-то попросит посредничать, используя наши отношения с той или иной страной, конечно, мы будем готовы такую возможность рассмотреть.
It is important to mention that while Greece continues to maintain a high state of alert over voiced concerns about a possible Turkish attack, NATO is actively facilitating deconfliction between its two member states. The Turkish military initially announced its decision to hold a naval exercise in the eastern Mediterranean for the 28th of October in a declared response to a pre-scheduled Greek exercise that was scheduled for the 29th. Nevertheless, after NATO Defense Ministerial, Turkey's Defense Minister Hulusi Akar said that both respective navies will stand down.
İyi niyet gösterisi olarak buradaki diyaloğu arttırıcı bir katkı sağlamak maksadıyla biz karşılıklı olarak bu NAVTEX'imizi iptal edebiliriz. Siz de ederseniz şeklinde Ve bunu son derece olumlu bulan Sayın Genel Sekreter desteklediler bizim görüşümüzü, teklifimizi. Daha sonra mütakiben de Yunanlı meslektaşımız da bu konuyu desteklediklerini, buna olumlu yaklaştıklarını ifade ettiler.
Meanwhile, in Ankara, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan declared now is the time for a realistic proposal, as he called it, in which a negotiated solution to the Cypriot conflict would realize an Ankara-aspired two-state agreement. Speaking alongside newly elected president of the northern part of Cyprus, which is essentially under Turkish control, President Erdogan emphasized the need to start negotiating a deal immediately.
Gelinen noktada müzakereleri münhasıran federasyon seçeneği temelinde başlatmanın zaman kaybı olacağını kesinlikle düşünüyoruz. Dolayısıyla artık iki devletli çözümün de gerçekçi bir yaklaşımla masaya getirilmesi gerektiğine inanıyoruz.
The Turkish Cypriot leader, for his part, warned that unless Cyprus complies to the Turkish proposal, it may not be offered another opportunity to negotiate. In related news, tensions are rapidly increasing between Turkey and Europe, and separately between Ankara and Washington. Speaking to supporters in the eastern Turkish Malatya province, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan taunted Washington over its threat to impose sanctions on Ankara over its military support to Azerbaijan, and in defiance of its NATO membership, its testing of its Russian-made S-400 surface-to-air systems.
Bazı Amerikalılar çıkıyor, İlham kardeşimi arıyor ve diyor ki biz sizin yanında kimin yer aldığını biliyoruz. Erdoğan var, Türkiye var. Biz Türkiye'ye de yeri gelirse yaptırım uygularız. Ya sen kimle dans ettiğinin farkında değilsin ya. Yaptırımın neyse geç kalma, yap. Biz sizden F-35 için adım attık, paramızı ödedik. Siz F-35'lerimizi vermediniz. Vermiyorsunuz ve bizi tehdit ettiniz. S-400'leri Rusya'ya geri gönderin dediniz. Ya biz kabile devleti değiliz. Biz Türkiye'yiz, Türkiye.
In that same address, the Turkish leader launched a fresh attack on his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, claiming the French president needed mental treatment over his attitude towards Islamism.
Macron'un zihinsel noktada bir tedaviye ihtiyacı var. İnanç hürriyetinden, inanç özgürlüğünden anlamayan ve kendi ülkesinde yaşayan milyonlarca farklı inanç mensubu insanlara bu şekilde davranan bir devlet başkanına başka ne denilebilir?
It is important to explain that Erdogan's insult, which prompted Paris to recall its ambassador to Ankara, was made in response to Macron's declared efforts to stamp out radical Islamism from France after a French history teacher named Samuel Paty was beheaded by an Islamist migrant who sought to murder the teacher for using a cartoon of the Muslim prophet Muhammad in a class on freedom of speech.
Samuel Paty est devenu vendredi le visage de la République, de notre volonté de briser les terroristes, de réduire les islamistes, de vivre comme une communauté de citoyens libres dans notre pays, le visage de notre détermination à comprendre, à apprendre, à continuer d'enseigner, à être libre.
Consequently, France stepped up its regulation on mosques, Muslim schools, and Islamist organizations in the country, which brought about Erdogan's remarks. The Turkish leader did not stop with France, lashing out also at leaders from Germany, the Netherlands, and elsewhere for what he termed to be a European attack on Islam. European leaders responded to the Turkish president by voicing solidarity with their French counterpart, including a vow to root out Islamism from Europe. Thank you for watching us as part of TV7's prayer.
Okay, so with current events taking place, current events unfolding, we've already discussed the Abraham Accord, that they are trying to get different nations in the Middle East to sign up with various agreements and contracts and so forth. And it's really setting the stage to essentially identify what nations are siding with, if you will, the King of the North, and what nations are siding with, if you will, the King of the South. So this has been, these battles between the King of the North and the King of the South have gone on for centuries, as we see. So in verse 14, we see that we are continuing the historic prophetic outline of Vision 4. And we see the historic prophetic outline right here in this chart. And Babylon, of course, has already fallen. That's why it's been put in parentheses. And Greece conquered Medo-Persia. And now Rome is rising. And so that is will be completing the historic prophetic outline through verse 45. But in 14, it says, also the robbers of thy people, introducing the new power of Rome, shall exalt themselves to establish the vision of Daniel, but they shall fall. One thing I want us to keep in mind about Rome, Rome has two iron legs. You know, we can't forget that. And so it's the Western leg and the Eastern leg. The Byzantine was the Eastern, and then the Western leg you see a lot with all the poperies. And through the Eastern leg also descended the caliphates. And then we saw the Ottomans rise up. And we see in these maps where the Ottoman Empire had all this green territory, including the territory at that time probably referred to as Palestine or some other title at that time. But still, it was Yahweh's promised land. And also it continued on into 1783. Of course, it diminishes greatly in the 20th and 21st century. It's really gravitated to the Republic of Turkey as how we see it today. Now, pagan imperial Rome is the fourth kingdom within the book of Daniel that rises. And you see that territory in blue. So the pagan imperial Rome, the fourth kingdom, existed 168 BC to AD 476. So again, we have the Western leg of the Roman Empire and the Eastern leg. So we have several people groups involved there. So on the bottom of your page, of page 280, let's see, I'm going to start with the rule of Antiochus IV Epiphanes from 175 to 164 BC. So during his brief reign of 12 years, Antiochus IV nearly exterminated the religion and culture of the Jews. Eventually, the Jews rose in revolt and drove his forces from Judea. In 168 BC, Rome had conquered Macedonia and made that country a part of its kingdom. Then pagan imperial Rome became the king of the north because of their connection with the people of Yahweh and being an earthly government ruling around Palestine. Note, earthly governments are not introduced into prophecy until they become connected with the people of Yahweh in some way. So it concludes with 7 years later in 161 BC, pagan Rome became connected with the Jews, the people of Yahweh at that time, by the famous Jewish League. Here, the Jews were a protectorate under Rome, which is recorded on in your book, page 280. Now, keeping that in mind, today, this theme of Israel being under those as a protectorate has been reinstituted by those that presently say they are Jews and are not, that are the ruling leaders of Israel in the Middle East and whom follow under the Babylonian Talmud. For the Bible defines a true Jew as one having been circumcised in heart by faith in Yahushua HaMashiach, and not purely by genealogy or by following Judaism. For there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave or free, male or female. So we continue, and we've already read verse 14, but we continue on the next page where it talks about pagan imperial Rome, the robber Romans, rising to become king of the north through the Caesars. Midway down your page right here, it says, this new power is now introduced as the robbers of thy people. How? The Romans were known as robbers or breakers of the people because they taxed the people heavily. The people were forced into slave labor to build roads, aqueducts, and walls with heavy rock foundations. These old roads may be seen in many parts of the old world yet today. Many were chained in the bottom of ships to become oarsmen in the Roman Navy. They also built the Great Road of London with slave labor. Rome was known as a grinding force or an iron kingdom. So Rome emerged and was destined by prophecy to 1, control the then known world, 2, exert a mighty influence to the end of time, 3, the Romans first made themselves felt in the affairs of Syria and Egypt. Later, the Romans robbed the Jews of their independence in 63 BC. In AD 70, they destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem. So in AD 70, actually some say 68 because there was a calendar adjustment of 2 years, be that as it may. We'll say AD 70, they destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem. So in 70 AD, Yahweh's people were dispersed, all of them. I mean, we know Israel had been previously exiled to Assyria, and they never came back to Yahweh, and they were scattered. Some of them may have returned with some of the people from the house of Judah when they were allowed to return to rebuild the temple and the city. However, when Jerusalem was destroyed again in AD 70, that was it. Yahweh's people had no country any longer. Yahweh's people, all 12 tribes, were scattered across the earth, and to this day are scattered across the earth. Yes, the land is there that once was often related to Yahweh's people, but in 1948, when it became a state, if you will, in the Middle East, that was much different. That was a much different, quote unquote, Israel. The name was essentially usurped and recreated by man, which we will get into further later on. Number 4, Rome speaks and shatters the dreams of Syria and Macedonia. Rome was determined to protect the boy child Ptolemy V. Of course, they were also gaining control over Egypt, while Syria and Macedonia were mediating to piecemeal Ptolemy V Epiphanes' kingdom. Yahweh raised up the Romans against them, even though their crimes were most horrible, and reduced Syria and Macedonia under Roman rule. Pagan imperial Rome was a nation ruled by harsh laws, which punished by crucifixion, the pointed stake, and other forms of torture. 8, subjugated nations felt this iron oppression. Israel also came under the iron fist of Roman rule. So this verse explains that the coming of Rome would establish the vision of the iron legs, the vision of the dreadful beast with iron teeth. The last phrase of Daniel 11, verse 14 says, "But they shall fall. The enemies of the boy Pharaoh all fell under Roman rule." Now, I don't want us to forget where we are with these beast kingdoms that are rising. And though we're studying the book of Daniel, and on our structure chart, we have come across the 4 beast kingdoms within Daniel, the book of Daniel. I have brought this out before, that prior to the book of Daniel, other beast kingdoms to consider are Egypt and Assyria. And then it picks up with Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome within Daniel. So again, we must not forget that Rome had 2 legs, Eastern and Western. Also, after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, again, all 12 tribes were scattered abroad into a more global exile, if you will, because presently we are Israel. We are born from above. We are making up the one new man with Yahushua HaMashiach as the head. So, but we still live in, quote unquote, an Egyptian type slavery, or a quote unquote Babylonian type slavery. So in our study books, great detail has been given to Rome and the papacy, and we are tracking that, and we know that the iron in the legs go all the way down to the toes. So we see Rome here, but we know Rome exists all the way to the very end, represented by the iron. But in Revelation 17, we read before that John the Revelator wrote and recorded that 5 of these kingdoms had fallen. And he said, one is. The nation that was present in his lifetime was Rome, right here. So in Revelation 17, he's talking about 5 had fallen thus far. And that gives us support to include Egypt and Assyria. 5 had fallen and 1 is, and that was Rome. And then, in my understanding, I share with you all that I consider the 7th one Mystery Babylon. So we must remember that present-day Israel was envisioned by Theodor Herzl, and the Balfour Declaration was instrumental in bringing that vision to fruition, along with several allied nations and along with the League of Nations. And all of these together began the formation of Mystery Babylon, whose leadership follows the Babylonian Talmud and presently occupies the land that was 100 years ago called Palestine. The 8th kingdom is, in my understanding, would be again the future Esau beast man and beast kingdom rising, empowered by Satan. Because as I have said several times before, the book of Revelation is ultimately a battle between good and evil. It is also ultimately a battle between Jacob and Esau. Of course, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And the true Israel are those born from above. So Revelation is about the battle between Esau, who I've identified and defined extensively in our past sessions, and Esau, we know, whose color is red. And we know the conglomerate beast in Revelation 17 displays the color red, which differs from the time when these nations are being formed under Revelation 13. Revelation 13, you have a beast that rises from the sea, and then midway down Revelation 13, you have the second beast that rises from the earth. I see the first beast of Revelation 13 as the nations that we've been reading about coming together in Daniel, forming alliances with one another. And then the Revelation 13 second beast being more of the false prophet figure. And then by the time you get to Revelation 17, all of them have come together. So Theodor Herzl was considered the visionary of the state. He was an Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist, playwright, political activist, and writer who was the father of modern political Zionism. Herzl formed the Zionist organization and promoted Jewish immigration to Palestine in an effort to form a Jewish state. Though he died before its establishment, he is known as the father of the state of Israel. So the present state in the Middle East has who they declare as their father, Theodor Herzl, not Yahweh. That says he is known as the father of the state of Israel. We are Israel born from above. Herzl is specifically mentioned in the Israeli Declaration of Independence and is officially referred to as, quote unquote, the spiritual father of the Jewish state. So we have one Father, and his name is Yahweh. Just a brief recap on the Balfour Declaration, November 2nd, 1917, statement of British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It was made in a letter from author James Balfour, pictured below. The British Foreign Secretary to Lionel Walter Rothschild, 2nd Baron Rothschild of Tring, a leader of the Anglo-Jewish community. Though the precise meaning of the correspondence has been disputed, its statements were generally contradictory to both the Sykes-Picot Agreement that we've discussed prior, a secret convention between Britain and France, and the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, an exchange of letters between the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, and Hussein ibn Ali, then Emir of Mecca, which in turn contradicted one another. So that was just an excerpt there, and here's just another short excerpt. We don't have time to read the whole thing. The Balfour Declaration was endorsed by the principal Allied powers and was included in the British Mandate over Palestine, formally approved by the newly created League of Nations on July 24th, 1922. In May 1939, the British government altered its policy in a white paper recommending a limit of 75,000 further immigrants and an end to immigration by 1944, unless the resident Palestinian Arabs of the region consented to further immigration. Zionists condemned the new policy, accusing Britain of favoring the Arabs. This point was made moot by the outbreak of World War II, 1939 to 45, and the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 with their father, Theodor Herzl. We continue to verse 15. So the king of the north, Antiochus IV, now he was the doozy. So the king of the north, Antiochus IV, shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, which refers to his choicest generals. Neither shall there be any strength to withstand. Verse 16, but he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand and enter into the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. So on page 283, we read about how Syria was geographically the king of the north. When pagan imperial Rome conquered Syria, its armies came down from the north into Israel. As a result, pagan imperial Rome secured the title king of the north, even though there is no specific mention in scripture until verse 40. Later, when pagan imperial Rome gave the scepter of power, seat, and authority over to the bishops of Rome and the popes, the papacy then secured the title King of the North, as in Daniel 11, verse 31 through 45. So that map illustrates how the Roman armies left Rome and had to march over Syria, right here, to enter Israel from the north. Thus, Rome became known as the King of the North. In verse 16, Egypt had not been able to stand against Antiochus III, king of the north, and Antiochus Asiaticus could not stand before Rome in 65 BC. No kingdom could resist the rising iron power of Rome. Reminder, the Romans became connected with the Jews by alliance in 161 BC, a date that holds a prominent place in the prophetic calendar. The Jews were now under Rome in a protectorate relationship, and Syria was conquered in 65 BC. So you see how many years had passed for Rome to actually conquer all this territory. So now Syria was conquered in 65 BC and added to the Roman kingdom when Pompey defeated Antiochus Asiaticus. So this page next, on page 284, is very fascinating. It's a very interesting clip and view of history. And in verse 17, it's recorded he, and Charlene inserted the possibilities here. He, Julius Caesar, shall also set his face to enter Egypt with the strength of his whole kingdom and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he, Egypt, shall give him the daughter of women, Cleopatra, corrupting her, but she shall not stand, with Julius in parentheses, on his side, neither before him, for she had her own political interest. So, review of history under verses 17 through 19. We read, Rome conquered Macedon, Greece, Thrace, Syria, and Judea. Egypt was all that remained of the whole kingdom of Alexander the Great. Rome pursued Egypt. Now in 51 BC, Ptolemy Auletes dies, and he leaves the crown to Cleopatra and Ptolemy the 12th, which were respectively 9 and 10 years old. This was through a former agreement with Rome. So Ptolemy Auletes' final wishes stated that Cleopatra and Ptolemy the 12th were to marry and reign jointly in Egypt. They were placed under the guardianship of the Romans in 51 BC with Pompey in charge. But Roman Pompey and Roman Julius Caesar quarreled and fought. Pompey, who was one of Julius Caesar's generals, fled to Egypt and was murdered by Ptolemy's orders. Julius Caesar became guardian of Cleopatra and Ptolemy. Cleopatra began quarreling with Ptolemy when he deprived her of her share of the government. Julius Caesar demands they come before him to settle this question after first disbanding their armies. Cleopatra and Ptolemy were not happy about Julius's orders. Julius Caesar reminded them he was acting in agreement with the will of their father. Advocates were to appear to plead the case of both Cleopatra and Ptolemy. Cleopatra decided she would be there in person. So she wraps herself in a carpet and is rolled out before Julius Caesar. He was 50 and she was 22. Julius Caesar decreed the siblings would rule jointly on the throne. Pausanias was the one who was principally instrumental in expelling Cleopatra from the throne. He spread a rumor among the people that Julius Caesar's plan was to put Cleopatra on the throne. There was open rebellion, and Egypt tried to destroy Rome's fleets. Julius won the battle at the Nile, brother Ptolemy tried to escape but drowned. In 47 BC, all of Egypt submitted to Julius Caesar in Rome. Alexander's Hellenistic or Greek kingdom was now totally absorbed by Rome. Julius Caesar stayed in Egypt much longer than intended. Cleopatra became his mistress and bore him a son. However, Julius's adopted son, Octavius, was legal heir to the Roman throne. As a result, Egypt and Rome did not merge. 44 BC, Julius was assassinated and Cleopatra joined herself to Mark Antony, an enemy of Julius's adopted son, Octavius. 31 BC, Octavius defeated the combined forces of Cleopatra and Antony. 30 BC, Antony's suicide opened the way for Octavius to rule. Cleopatra committed suicide rather than join herself to Octavius. In 30 BC, this was the end of Egypt's dynasty. Egypt became a province of the pagan imperial Roman kingdom. So that was the history in a nutshell. So presently, the so-named Israel in the Middle East no longer identifies true Israel. And it will not until Yahweh restores his people and the land. Some true believers actually do live in the present state of Israel, but the majority of those born from above are still scattered across this earth. The promised land still belongs only to Yahweh. The 12 tribes, again, were scattered by Yahweh all over the earth. Some of the house of Judah and parts of Israel returned after the Babylonian captivity, but Jerusalem was once again destroyed, as I shared earlier, in 70 AD. Mankind attempted to make prophecy happen by reestablishing settlements in Yahweh's land and naming it Israel. But his word says that Yahweh will gather the true Israel, those born from above and circumcised of heart through Yahusha from the four corners of the earth. The Messiah that mankind will usher in the Middle East will be the false Messiah. And because of people's lack of knowledge, there will be a great falling away and many will perish. So in 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome at the hands of 60 fellow Romans, led by Commander Longinus, who put an end to the insolence of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar had practiced military butchery for his own personal ambitions. Julius Caesar had attempted to replace the Roman Republican form of government with a personal dictatorship. This led to his death. Julius died suddenly, surrounded by men he had cared for, had promoted, or had spared. He was struck down, struggling, till he fell dead at the foot of Pompey's statue. Thus he suddenly stumbled and fell and was not found in 44 BC. Most individuals who have studied the history of Rome are well acquainted with the story of Julius Caesar's death. His trusted friend Brutus turned traitor and put a dagger in Caesar's heart. So the promised land of Yahweh. Palestine was a land of milk and honey for ancient Israel. And, you know, at that time, most of all the 12 tribes, most of all that proclaimed Yahweh as their Elohim were physically actually in ancient Israel. That's why so many people get confused to this day. So Palestine was a land of milk and honey. It's a very rich and wealthy land. It was favored by the shield of omnipotence and providing many spiritual and secular advantages. Israel was put in a geographical position to accomplish a work for Yahweh. Palestine's location was at the crossroads of the ancient world, which encouraged Israel's interaction with mankind. Yahweh's proposed to raise up a favored nation that would be the depository of his ways. Pagan Rome literally invaded and conquered this ancient glorious land, beautiful Jerusalem. So as I shared, at one time the land was associated with the people of Yahweh, but after the destruction in 70 AD, all 12 tribes are now scattered across the earth. And Israel, defined in the Bible, are those born from above. Isaiah 11, verse 11 and verse 12. It says, and it shall be in that day that Yahweh sets his hand again a second time to recover the remnant of his people. This is speaking of what many refer to as the greater Exodus. If you want to know what he's going to do for us, start reading in Isaiah 11:11. So, and it shall be in that day that Yahweh sets his hand, not Theodor Herzl's hand, but his hand again a second time to recover the remnant of his people who are left from Asher and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush, from Elam and from Shinar, from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. And he shall raise a banner for the nations and gather the outcast of Israel and assemble the dispersed of Judah. Where? From the four corners of the earth. So we continue in verse 18 and 19. After this shall he, parentheses, Julius Caesar, turn his face unto the isles and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf, or a prince from his own court, shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. So it is in reference to his death. In verse 19, then he, Julius Caesar, in parentheses, shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, parentheses, Rome, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. And we just read the history behind Julius there. So after Julius Caesar had conquered Syria and Asia Minor, he defeated the last fragments of Pompey's party in Africa and Spain. He then returned to Rome. He was surrounded by his own men. 44 BC, again, we know he was assassinated in Rome at the hands of 60 of his fellow Romans. And that we have already reviewed. But in studying the book of Daniel, and especially in studying chapter 11, there's diverse insights and opinions I want you all to be made aware of. From this site, Study Grow Know blog, in his Daniel part 11, Daniel chapter 11, part 7, he states in verse 19, we learn, see, like here, and as Charlene has studied, she has come to the conclusion that verse 19 is referring to Julius Caesar. But I want you all to be aware that there's other viewpoints on that for your studies that you can study out and see what you find. But he writes in verse 19, we learn that while Antiochus was held at bay by Scipio, Antiochus turned his attention to strengthening and fortifying his own small empire with Antioch as his capital. So that's how that city got its name, Antioch. It was there he died in 187 BC, just a year after being held in check by Scipio. Once Antiochus III, right here in the middle of the picture, died, his eldest son, Seleucus IV, took the reins. Dr. Constable notes that he wound up taxing his subjects so mightily in an effort to placate the growing power of Rome that his own Jewish tax collector wound up poisoning him. Heliodorus, and that's recorded in the Apocrypha book, 2 Maccabee, chapter 3, verse 7. Heliodorus is likely the oppressor mentioned in verse 20, who was sent by Seleucus. He oppressed the Israelites through extensive taxation, but being Jewish himself, Heliodorus ultimately turned on the very king who sent him throughout Israel to oppress or collect the taxes. Murdering the king had its dire consequences, though, as Constable notes, quote, "This assassination set the stage for the terrible persecutions of the Jews that followed. Thus, Seleucus IV did not die because of mob violence, as his father had, or in battle, but from poison, as this verse predicted." We have differing views on associated histories when it comes in relation to Daniel chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, and a few beyond. So why might there be varying views? Now, don't get me wrong, the histories of each that I have read are probably very accurate. But what I'm saying is that teachers study prophecy, they have different views on which segment of history is connected to verses 17 through 19. So why might there be varying views? First, Seleucus IV and Julius Caesar have similar military backgrounds and historical murderous fates. I mean, they both were murdered. They both were in the military leaders. Plus, they both heavily taxed their kingdoms. So you can see why people that study history and the scriptures connect the dots accordingly. So, and then secondly, we have similar titles and names that are replicated, like with the Cleopatras, like with the Caesars, like with Epiphanes, like with the Augustuses, and so forth. Now, speaking of the term Epiphanes, I did want to bring this out because earlier, well, in last week's session, I mentioned that Epiphanes is used in both the North and South kingdoms, and it was a term meaning God manifest, or the glorious, or the illustrious. And so many of the kings, the leaders, added the name Epiphanes to their name. So when it came to Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, which he was the doozy, the people would twist his title due to his eccentricities and call him the name Antiochus Epimanes, the mad one, a word play on his divine title Epiphanes. His narcissistic behavior earned him another nickname in Jewish sources, the Wicked One. He could captivate the common people with his appearance of geniality, but in reality proved to be a forbidding despot with contempt for those who would not submit to his will. So I just want everyone to be mindful that different Bible scholars connect these verses to different time periods in history. So these historical accounts of Seleucus IV and Julius Caesar both occurred relatively close to one another, but which one was tied to these specific verses in Daniel 11 vary among teachers of prophecy, and also it varies among commentators as well. And that is probably one of the reasons why Charlene chose to do her book and explain it and support her decisions with her documentation. In verse 20, we see, then shall stand up in his estate, and it's in parentheses, estate of Julius Caesar, from that point of view, a raiser of taxes, Octavius, who is later called Augustus Caesar. In the glory of the kingdom, parentheses, Rome, now the pinnacle of greatness, but within few days, after a rule of about 40 years in parentheses, he shall be destroyed, and it's noted that Augusta dies at age 76, neither in anger nor in battle. We know Augustus becomes very ill, and he apparently dies in his sleep at Nola in AD 14. So of interest, Augusta founded the Roman kingdom and the position of Rome emperor. Therefore, the word Augustus quickly became a synonym for emperor, and every emperor was known as an Augustus. In the 5th and 6th century after Yahusha, the head of the Roman state was succeeded by the head of the Roman church. Until that time, the men who acted as bishops or the bishops of Rome were laying the foundation for the Pope to become the head of the church and corrector of heretics. Other notes, Augustus Caesar was known for taking census and registering the people for the purpose of taxation. These tax collectors were called the publicans in the New Testament. So this is stated that Yahusha is born during the reign of Augustus Caesar in 4 BC. And of course, we know that that year may vary. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. So let's see what page we are on now. Okay, page 287. The fact that the Messiah was born in Bethlehem, that his parents went there to register and pay the taxes, gives the correct timing and place for the fulfillment of verse 20 of the historic prophetic outline of Daniel 11. Now, this is an important statement Charlene makes. Prophecy points to events which revolve around the coming of Yahusha HaMashiach. So, of course, it's recorded in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. Now, we've discussed some of these things in the past, but Luke chapter 3, verse 1 is a very important verse for us to remember for getting the correct timing of when Yahusha was mikvahd by John the Immerser. And it helps us anchor a few dates in history. Now, these are things for all of us to consider. I know there's several viewpoints on the birth of Yahusha. I know there's several viewpoints on the possible mikvah of Yahusha, and there's several viewpoints on the time frame of Yahusha's ministry, whether it was 490 days, making him the Lamb of Elohim that was a year old and not greater than 2 years old, versus 3.5-year ministry. But if we're looking at Luke 3:1, it does play an important role in determining the year of Yahusha's mikvah and subsequent crucifixion. So when someone is studying these facts, they must come to Luke chapter 3, verse 1. Not only that, but nestled within Yahusha's ministry lays a calendar anchor to a Jubilee year that we've talked about before, when he stands up in the synagogue and he reads Isaiah and tells the congregation, this day, the scripture has been fulfilled, the day that to set the captives free. And all of the words in that verse allude to a Jubilee year. So the first evidence that we can look at and consider, just saying consider, Roman records regarding the 15th year of Tiberius's reign. In Luke 3:1, we find that John began baptizing and Yahusha was baptized in the 15th year of Tiberius's reign. According to Roman records, Tiberius reigned with the aging Augustus. That's who we just spoke about, Caesar Augustus. So according to Roman records, Tiberius, who followed Caesar Augustus, so Tiberius reigned with the aging Augustus as co-regent beginning in the year 12 AD. He became the sole regent in 14 AD, but his 15th year is reckoned from 12 AD, and so would end up being 27 AD. According to Luke 3:1, both Herod and Philip were reigning. 27 AD was the 28th year of the reigns of Herod in Galilee and Philip in Iturea, after the passing of their father Herod the Great, soon after the lunar eclipse of January 10th, 1 BC. So there's other ways to mark calendars and determine dates is by using the biblical astronomy. The year of Augustus's death is firmly fixed and confirmed by a lunar eclipse recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus Annals, Book 1, paragraph 28. However, Edward Gibbon noted in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, volume 1, page 30, that prior to his death, Augustus dictated a law by which the future prince, in this case Tiberius, was invested with an authority equal to his own over the provinces and the armies. Within the provinces, Tiberius had equal standing and authority with Caesar Augustus, even while Augustus was still alive. Historian Will Durant points out that all Rome, which hated Tiberius for his stern Puritanism, resigned itself to the fact that though Augustus was still prince, Tiberius had begun to rule. Durant, The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, page 231. Thus, the reign of Tiberius is dated not from his sole reign at the death of Augustus, but from the beginning of his joint reign 2 years prior to his death in AD 12, when Tiberius was given legal equality with Augustus. The 15th year, if Tiberius would then correspond to AD 27. And in Luke 3:1, of course, that is when John the Mercer is beginning his, does someone have Luke 3:1 handy that they could read that?
What was it again, Libby?
Luke chapter 3, verse 1.
I've got it, Libby.
Okay. Betty.
John, okay. Now, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea, and of the region of Trachonitis, and Lysanias, and tetrarch of Abilene.
Okay, did it refer to John beginning his baptizing?
Annas and Caiaphas being the high priest, the word of Elohim came unto John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. And he came into all the country about Jordan, preaching and baptizing.
Right. Okay, so at that time, it is also believed that Yahusha was also baptized. So from that perspective, that's why some conclude that Yahusha was mikvahd or baptized by John the Immerser in 27 AD. Now, what we spoke about before, and we all know the scripture, that the Passover lamb could not be greater than it had to be 1 year of age and not greater than 2. So in order for, and we also know when Yahusha was mikvahd, that was when he was identified as, behold, the Lamb of Elohim. So that's why that date is important, because if we find the correct date of him being mikvahd, then it will let us know that his ministry was 490 days, and I've shown you the dates that correspond to that from the time he was mikvahd as the Lamb of Elohim to the day of Pentecost was 490 days. So that's reviewed in the chronological Gospels, and Shauna Manfredine has done some work on that, and Also, Michael Rood had written a book on that, and she used that as one of her references. Did someone have a question?
Yeah, Libby, I have a question on that last statement. It said halfway through it says 2 years prior to his death in AD 12. If you take away 2, you have 10, and if you add 15, you just have 25. Or am I looking at that wrong?
Okay. Let's see. Where do you see that?
The very last, the last statement, the last, yeah.
Okay. Thus, the reign of Tiberius is dated not from his sole reign at the death of Augustus, which would have been 14, but from the beginning of his joint reign, which is AD 12. When Tiberius was given legal equality with Augustus. So it's 15 plus 12 be 27.
I misread, sorry.
Oh yeah, that's okay. It's easy to do. It's easy to do. Now, another supporting possibility is the 46 years since the temple was built. We read about that in John, when the Yehudim answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us since you are doing these?" Yahusha answered and said to them, "Destroy this dwelling place, and in 3 days I shall raise it." And the Yehudim said, "It took 46 years to build this dwelling place, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But he spoke about the dwelling place of his body. So, according to John 2:13, Yahusha's baptism and beginning of his ministry happened in the 46th year of the temple reconstruction project. And that's supported here in the Bible history outline. It says King Herod at the beginning of 19 BC. Let's see, it says, none of the restorations or extensions of the second temple of Zerubbabel could compare with the work begun by King Herod the Great at the beginning of 19 BC. And from another source in biblicalarchaeological.org, again, it shows the date in 19 BC, the master builder, King Herod the Great, began the most ambitious building project of his life, the rebuilding of the temple and the Temple Mount in lavish style. So again, if you add 46 to 19, you would come to 27 AD. And thirdly, according to Luke 3:23, Yahusha was not yet 30 years of age, which is better translated as nearing the age of 30 when he was baptized. This also checks out with 27 AD, counting from his birth year of 3 BC. Now, like I said, some say 4 BC, and I believe there's been some recent Zoom sessions with some other insights on his date of birth. But the other thing we must consider, and I want you all to consider this, is how long was his ministry? He was the Lamb of Elohim. He was identified as the Lamb of Elohim at his mikvah. The lamb at Passover could not be greater, had to be 1 year of age, but not greater than 2 years of age. And that's just a biblical fact. So we all must deal with that. And even though this says in our books, the crucifixion of Yahusha was AD 27, more than likely that was the mikvah. The crucifixion, more than likely, if we go with the dates we just discussed, and I'm not saying those are correct, but that's where I'm leaning, it would be his crucifixion would have been in AD 28. But it says, and with the arms of a flood shall they, quote, in parentheses, the Jews be overflown or conquered from before, and parentheses, suffer death, yea, also the prince of the covenant, which she identifies as Yahushua HaMashiach. Again, there's different insights on that, but I definitely track with her on that. So in our books, and it's on page 289, it's recorded in corresponding to verse 22. Luke chapter 3, verse 1 that we read earlier confirms it was the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar when John the Baptist was preaching. In AD 12, Tiberius Caesar began reigning with his stepfather Augustus. This is when his reign began. So here again, she's noting that it's AD 12 that Tiberius's reign began, not AD 14. He did, however, take the throne in AD 14, but he was co-regent with Caesar Augustus in AD 12. So AD 12 plus 15 years equals AD 27 for the time frame of Luke chapter 3, verse 1. So note the Prince of the Covenant in verse 22 was none other than Yahushua HaMashiach. He was quote unquote broken or conquered and crucified now she states there in AD 31. The reason that he was broken was to fulfill the covenant promise that a Savior would come to die for the sins of the people. Understanding about some of the misled insights to him having a 3.5-year ministry is recorded through the work, like I shared, of Michael Rood, and also the work that I've seen Shauna Manfredine do as well. And they go into great detail about how that got inserted into scriptural understanding. So that's a biggie. And that's something that we should be mindful of. And so I do, if you get an opportunity to maybe purchase the Chronological Gospel series by Shauna Manfredine, or get I think the book written by Michael Rood. I kind of like how Shauna Manfredine teaches it, because she does use PowerPoints, and she does bring the scripture in, and she does bring all the supporting documentation in with the cross references and page numbers. So very, very interesting study. And that just so happens to coincide with our Daniel study tonight in Daniel chapter 11. Probably be a good place to end this session. And then we'll go ahead and take some Q&A, and then we'll pick up next week here.